Lawrence Taylor, the defensive legend once considered the greatest terror in NFL history, the man who forced an entire league to change how it protected the quarterback, the one who won MVP, 2 Super Bowl championships, and built a career enough to be called the icon of absolute power, once had it all, before his life took a devastating turn. After leaving the stadium lights, Lawrence Taylor did not step into a peaceful chapter of fame, but gradually slid into a chain of tragedies that lasted many years, where addiction, legal troubles, and self-destruction replaced discipline and control. The arrests related to drugs, the suspensions, and the off-field scandals that had been covered up when he was still delivering victories now became public headlines, eroding the image of a legend once worshipped by America. No longer having the power to force the organization to protect him, no longer having achievements to trade for silence, Lawrence Taylor had to face alone the consequences of those years of living without breaks, when a reputation once invulnerable was dragged down to the level of his personal mistakes, broken relationships, a fractured family, old friends gradually disappearing when he was no longer the center of victory, leaving a lonely man in the very name that had once created glory. In the public's eyes, the image of number 56, charging straight at opponents with predatory instinct, could no longer cover up the reality that he was gradually losing the ability to control himself, that the cravings and impulsive behaviors had taken over his life more powerfully than any tactic on the field. That tragedy was not a single fall, but a collapse piece by piece, layer by layer, as each mistake followed the next, and there was no one with enough power or reason to stop it. The man who once made the entire NFL tremble now became evidence of the dark side of fame, of the price to pay, when a genius is indulged for too long without anyone preparing him a safe path when the spotlight disappeared. And right at the starting point of that collapse, when the scandals could no longer be hidden and the consequences began to pile up, the central question emerged hauntingly. What really happened to Lawrence Taylor? What caused a man strong enough to shake an entire league to end his journey in addiction, chaos, and loneliness? And did this tragedy stem from his own personal choices, or from a system that exploited his power to the fullest, but never taught him how to survive when victory was no longer a protective shield? The downfall of Lawrence Taylor was not a sudden fall, nor was it a single moment when everything suddenly shattered, but the result of a long accumulating process, where each wrong choice was overlooked, each warning ignored, each boundary erased, because he was still too important to victory. Right from his early years in the NFL, Lawrence Taylor was exposed early to drugs in an environment where the use of stimulants was not rare, sometimes even seen as part of the locker room culture, where players sought ways to release pressure, soothe pain, and extend their ability to compete. For Taylor, drugs at first were not a sign of decline, but something that came with partying, with the feeling of invincibility of a young man standing at the top of the world. But very quickly, the line between control and dependence became blurred. The NFL of that era saw it all, but chose silence, because Lawrence Taylor was not just a good player, he was the center of an entire defensive system, the symbol that brought victories, revenue, and reputation. And therefore, deviant behaviors were overlooked as long as he still destroyed opponents every Sunday. The prolonged parties, the limitless lifestyle, and the feeling of always being indulged nurtured a man who believed no consequence was big enough to touch him, that every mistake could be erased by another outstanding game. But as his career continued, the self-destructive behaviors no longer stayed in the locker room or discreet party nights, but gradually spilled into everyday life, bringing legal issues, suspensions, scandals that made the name Lawrence Taylor appear in newspapers in increasingly heavy contexts. Each time, he would return to the field, playing with the familiar ferocity, as if the violence on the field was the only way for him to prove he still had value, that everything was still okay, and the system would continue to forgive. Alongside that indulgence, Lawrence Taylor's personal life gradually cracked, as close relationships were eroded by addiction, by emotional absence, by uncontrolled impulses, causing family and those once closest to him to drift away. He was not taught how to seek help, not placed in a proper support structure, because throughout his peak years, the only role everyone needed from him was victory. The fear he instilled in opponents, not the stability of a human being off the field. When his performance began to decline, when age and injuries made Lawrence Taylor no longer the destructive machine he once was, the invisible protective shell that the NFL had built around him also gradually vanished, exposing a man accustomed to living in indulgence, but completely unprepared for loneliness. Legal problems were no longer resolved in silence, personal mistakes no longer shielded by titles, and Lawrence Taylor, for the first time, had to face the full consequences of many years of living without restraint. There was no final protective system waiting for him when the lights went out, no support network strong enough to pull him out of the spiral of addiction and self-destruction, because for a long time, all resources had been poured into keeping him on the field, not keeping him safe in life. The collapse, therefore, did not take the form of a single tragedy, but an inevitable chain of results from an environment that chose victory over the human being, that exploited Lawrence Taylor's genius to the extreme, but never stopped to ask what he was enduring, what he was gradually losing. And when everything finally went beyond control, when addiction, scandals, and broken relationships hit at once, Lawrence Taylor was left alone in the ruins of his own life, becoming a painful testament to the truth that downfall rarely comes unexpectedly. It is only the unavoidable outcome of many years of being neglected, indulged, and not helped in time. If one wants to understand why Lawrence Taylor could become the terror of the entire NFL but never find peace for himself, the answer does not lie in the lavish parties or the peak years of indulgence, but deeper, where his story began very early, in Williamsburg, Virginia. Lawrence Taylor was born into an ordinary working-class family, not wealthy, not powerful, where life revolved around basic needs and prolonged instability. His childhood was not enveloped in a sense of security or solid emotional structures, but a series of days having to adapt on his own, finding ways to stand firm in an environment that was anything but gentle. The Taylor family was not a tragedy in the sensational sense, but it bore the shape of many American working-class families of that time. Busy parents, little time for children, discipline that existed but without subtle guidance on emotions, and children who grew up believing they had to fend for themselves. Lawrence Taylor was not taught how to name his fears, not encouraged to express weakness, let alone guided on how to control anger or regulate inner impulses, those seemingly invisible skills, but ones that determine a person's ability to survive into adulthood. Unlike many sports stars discovered and honed from very early on, Lawrence Taylor came to American football quite late. He was not the boy directed to become a professional athlete from elementary school without the years of proper training in discipline, in self-control, tied to elite sports. When Taylor started playing football, he brought with him everything accumulated from childhood: unresolved anger, the need to prove himself, and a sharp survival instinct. American football was not just a sport to him, but the first place in his life where he realized that aggression, speed, and power could bring clear rewards. On the field, no one required Lawrence Taylor to talk about his emotions. No one asked what he was afraid of or how he was hurting. All he needed to do was charge straight at the opponent, and each successful collision was met with praise. Right there, a dangerous pattern gradually formed. Lawrence Taylor learned that attacking was the most effective way to exist, that if he was the one causing fear, he would not be the vulnerable one. He did not learn how to stop, did not learn how to listen to his body or mind, but learned how to push every limit further away. The absence of lessons in emotional control left Taylor without any tools to handle the increasingly heavy pressures as his talent began to be noticed. Instead of being guided on balance, he was rewarded for ferocity. Instead of being reminded of limits, he was encouraged to surpass them. In that environment, instinct became the compass, while self-regulation barely existed. An unstable childhood did not directly create addiction or tragedy, but it planted a silent seed, the belief that strength was the only thing reliable. Lawrence Taylor grew up with the feeling that if he did not attack first, he would be left behind. That softness only led to hurt. When he later entered the world of professional American football, where pressure, money, and expectations were amplified many times over, that seed began to sprout in a ruthless way. He had no foundation to build inner peace, no habit of seeking help, and no one to teach him that slowing down or admitting he had a problem was not failure. All Lawrence Taylor knew was to move forward, stronger, faster, more ferocious, because that was the only way life had ever shown him to be effective. That lack of preparation for peace did not show when he was young and rising. On the contrary, it helped him stand out, turning him into an uncontrollable force on the field, a player who played with pure instinct without being held back by fear. But those very qualities, when not balanced by emotional discipline and self-regulation, quietly laid the foundation for long-term tragedy. Lawrence Taylor entered the NFL with an extraordinary body and a warrior spirit, but lacking the life skills necessary to survive in a world not measured only by victory every Sunday. When success came, he had no frame of reference to handle it. When pressures piled up, he had no healthy outlet to release them. And when temptations appeared, he had no strong inner barrier to say no. Looking back from the collapse that has been exposed in the present, Lawrence Taylor's childhood is not an excuse for the later mistakes, but the key to understanding why he was so vulnerable to an indulgent and harsh environment like the NFL. A child who grows up without being taught how to find peace will very easily confuse silence with strength, attack with control, external victory with inner stability. And when that child becomes a man possessing unprecedented athletic power, that deficiency does not disappear, but is only hidden under the layer of glory. Right from Williamsburg, Virginia, from an unstable working-class family, from coming to American football late without emotional preparation, the seeds of Lawrence Taylor's tragedy were sown, quietly growing through the years, only to one day fully reveal themselves when the stadium lights were no longer bright enough to cover the voids that he was never taught how to fill. From those unstable childhood years, American football entered Lawrence Taylor's life as an escape door, but at the same time as the most sophisticated trap that he never realized. Football gave Lawrence Taylor something he had never had: a clear identity. On the field, he was no longer a boy, growing up in an ordinary working-class family in Williamsburg, no longer someone who had to fend for himself in silence, but became a recognized warrior, an individual whose value was measured by strength and impact. Every successful tackle, every time he made an opponent fall, brought him a sense of control, a sense of existence, a sense that he finally had a position no one could deny. The power that football gave Lawrence Taylor was pure, direct, and needed no explanation. He could impose his will on others, and the entire stadium would applaud it. But right at this point, the escape began to turn into a trap. Football did not require Lawrence Taylor to understand himself, did not force him to heal the emotional voids formed from childhood. On the contrary, this sport legitimized his violence, turning aggression into skill, anger into competitive advantage, and attack instinct into a rewarded quality. Every time Lawrence Taylor charged at an opponent with all his strength, no one asked what he was angry about, what fear he was running from, or what inner void he was trying to fill. All that was seen was the result: a successful play, a defeated opponent, a broken tactic. In that world, emotions were not processed, but transformed into collisions. The more he played football, the deeper Lawrence Taylor learned this dangerous lesson. He learned that destroying others was the fastest path to recognition, that if he was ferocious enough, ruthless enough on the field, no one would see the flaws inside. Football not only gave him power, but also taught him how to hide his fragility under physical armor. The powerful collisions became the only language he mastered, and in that language there was no room for self-questioning or healing. When success came, it reinforced the belief that this way of living was right, that nothing needed to change because everything was bringing victory. The danger of football for Lawrence Taylor did not lie in immediate injuries or physical pain, but in the fact that this sport never required him to develop the skills necessary to protect himself off the field. He was not taught how to face failure without self-destruction, not guided on how to manage emotions when pressure increased, and not prepared for the moment when physical strength was no longer enough to solve every problem. Football gave him a clear role, but did not teach him how to live when that role was threatened. It gave him a sense of invincibility, but did not give him the tools to handle vulnerability. In the fiercely competitive environment, Lawrence Taylor soon realized that the more ferocious he was, the more he was valued. Coaches saw him as a weapon, teammates saw him as a shield, and the media saw him as a symbol of unlimited strength. No one had the motive to question the price paid for that style of play, because that price was not paid immediately. Early warning signs, if any, were easily drowned out by applause and consecutive victories. Football, in Lawrence Taylor's case, was not just a sport, but a system that reinforced a way of life, where violence was legitimized and self-control was seen as unnecessary. That is why American football both saved Lawrence Taylor from the invisibility of childhood and locked him tightly in a dangerous mold. He learned to destroy opponents so effectively that no one could stop him, but never learned how to protect himself from the inner pulls. When facing stress, he had no language other than attack. When feeling empty, he did not know to seek stillness, but sought stronger stimulations, and when addictions began to appear later, they were not a complete deviation, but the logical continuation of a life accustomed to solving every problem with high intensity. Football gave Lawrence Taylor a perfect stage to unleash the most ferocious parts of himself, but never set boundaries for it. No one told him that strength needs to come with personal responsibility, that instinct needs to be controlled so it does not turn back to destroy its owner. When he was young and invincible, this trap was almost invisible. But later on, as pressure, expectations, and temptations increased, Lawrence Taylor began to pay the price for never being taught how to protect himself. Looking back, American football for Lawrence Taylor was both the only escape he found and the silent foundation of long-term tragedy. It gave him identity when he needed it most, gave him power when he craved recognition, but at the same time nurtured a man who only knew how to move forward through violence and instinct. When the stadium lights were still bright, that trap was covered by glory. But when the lights went out, what remained was a man too accustomed to destroying others, but completely unequipped to protect himself from the very voids that football never helped him fill. In the context where American football had become both the escape and the trap for Lawrence Taylor, the NFL of the 1980s was the fertile ground that nurtured and legitimized the entire tragedy. That was an era when victory was placed above all other values, where teams existed not to care for people, but to maximize strength and competitive advantage at any cost. The NFL at that time was not yet a modern corporate sports entity with comprehensive healthcare programs, but a brutal arena where violence was glorified, personal sacrifice was seen as duty, and long-term consequences were almost outside the scope of concern. In that environment, players who brought victories were seen as the most valuable assets, and Lawrence Taylor, with his ability to shake the entire league, quickly became the symbol of that philosophy. Drugs in the NFL of this period were not rare or shocking, but an implicit part of the locker room culture. Stimulants were used to reduce pain, to maintain playing intensity, to release stress after fierce battles, and the boundary between medicine, recreation, and dependence almost did not exist. Loose testing, formal penalties, and the readiness to overlook violations if the player still contributed to victory created an environment where drugs were dangerously downplayed. For Lawrence Taylor, that meant behaviors that should have been seen as early warning signals were dissolved into success. When he was still breaking opposing offensive lines, when he was still bringing decisive wins, his personal issues were pushed aside, as if they did not exist. Mental health, in that context, had almost no place in any serious discussion. There was no language to talk about depression, no structure for proper addiction support, and certainly no concept that a player needed to be protected from himself. Every problem was reduced to personal will, strong enough to play, weak, then eliminated. Lawrence Taylor grew up and matured in that very ideology, where admitting difficulty was not the first step to healing, but seen as a sign of weakness. In such an environment, a player who played with extreme instinct and intensity like Taylor was not only not restrained, but encouraged to go even further because he was the perfect embodiment of the kind of football the NFL wanted to promote at the time. The fact that Lawrence Taylor was shielded was not a conspiracy of one individual or one team alone, but the natural consequence of a system that prioritized absolute victory. Coaches needed him to survive, teams needed him to attract audiences, and the entire league needed him as a symbol of ferocity and drama. When rumors about partying lifestyle, about stimulant use began to appear, the common reaction was not intervention, but downplaying, delaying, or ignoring, as long as Lawrence Taylor still showed up on the field on game day. Every time he returned after a scandal, played another outstanding game, the system was reinforced in the wrong belief that everything was still under control. The most painful thing in this entire picture is the complete absence of a responsible stopping point. No one set clear limits for Lawrence Taylor. No one said that there were things that could no longer be indulged, because no one wanted to be the first to sacrifice victory for the long-term safety of a player. The NFL of the 1980s had no post-retirement programs, no life transition plans, and no concept that the league's responsibility extended beyond 60 minutes on the field each week. When a player was still useful, he was protected. When no longer, he fended for himself. Lawrence Taylor, throughout his peak years, was always on the first side of that equation, and therefore his problems were postponed until they could no longer be hidden. That system did not directly create addiction in Lawrence Taylor, but it created ideal conditions for addiction to develop unchecked. It did not force him to use drugs, but it turned a blind eye to clear signs because early intervention meant accepting the risk of losing a winning weapon. In such an environment, personal responsibility and collective responsibility blended vaguely, and when everything finally went beyond control, it was hard to point to a single moment where things could have been different. Looking back from the collapse, the NFL of the 1980s appears not just as the background, but as a silent agent of the tragedy. A system built on violence, indulging deviant behavior, and ignoring mental health not only exploited Lawrence Taylor's talent to the maximum, but also drained his ability to protect himself. When victory was still the absolute priority, the human being behind the helmet became secondary. And when Lawrence Taylor finally could no longer bring victories as before, the system that had once lifted him up was also the first to let go. His tragedy, therefore, cannot be understood only as a series of wrong personal choices, but as the product of an era where genius was nurtured in indulgence, grew in silence, and was left alone when the price of victory became too clear to continue ignoring. From that system of indulgence and absolute prioritization of victory, Lawrence Taylor's career exploded like an unprecedented phenomenon, both dazzlingly brilliant and quietly harboring pains that no one saw. In 1981, Lawrence Taylor was selected by the New York Giants in the second round of the draft, a decision that at the time no one could imagine would change NFL history so profoundly. Right in his rookie season, Taylor needed no time to adjust, no need to learn how to wait. He stepped straight into the league with ferocious style, terrifying speed, and pure predatory instinct, immediately shattering every mold about the linebacker position. What Lawrence Taylor achieved in his rookie season was not just statistics or awards, but a sense of fear spreading across the sidelines, as quarterbacks for the first time had to account for the presence of a defender as a constant threat. The NFL was forced to adjust. Offensive lines had to redesign blocking schemes, coaches had to change how they protected the passer, and the entire league gradually realized that a single individual could force the whole system to adapt. That ascent happened at a dizzying speed. Lawrence Taylor won Defensive Rookie of the Year, then consecutively became Defensive Player of the Year, and reached an unimaginable peak in 1986 when he was awarded the full NFL MVP. Something so rare, it was almost unthinkable for a defensive player. His tackles did not just end plays, but ended the rhythm of the game. His sacks were not just yard losses, but direct blows to the opponent's spirit. When the New York Giants won those Super Bowl championships, Lawrence Taylor was honored as the soul of the team, the symbol of the ferocious and unforgiving football that America worshipped at the time. The media praised him as a force of nature, a man born to destroy every opposing plan, and with each passing week, his legend was etched deeper into fans' minds. But parallel to that unimaginable ascent, Lawrence Taylor's life off the field remained in untouched darkness. No one in strategy meetings, press conferences, or on the pages of major sports papers asked how a person living at such extreme intensity was paying the price. Success came too fast, too big, making every sign of instability invisible. When Taylor won, no one needed to know how he slept, how he lived, or what he turned to in order to fill the void when the game ended. Football continued to be the only place that brought order to his life, and therefore, every time he left the field, the emptiness became even deeper. In those peak years, Lawrence Taylor lived in a state where external glory continually compensated for internal wounds. The individual and team titles created the illusion that everything was fine, that as long as he was still playing at the highest level, there was no problem needing to be addressed. The NFL, the team, and the public all unwittingly reinforced that illusion, because no one wanted to disrupt a perfectly running winning machine. Every time Taylor returned after a minor scandal, played another outstanding game, the story continued as if nothing had happened, and the pain inside him was pushed back a little further, not healed, but buried deeper. Lawrence Taylor's soaring career therefore carried a bitter paradox. The greater he was on the field, the more he was abandoned off it. The more he was revered as an icon, the less he was seen as a human being needing support. Coaches saw him as a tactical weapon, teammates saw him as a mental shield, and the media saw him as a story that sold papers. But very few saw an individual living in constant tension, where every emotion was suppressed until only intensity remained. There was no space for weakness, no time for introspection, because any sign of slowing down could be interpreted as declining performance. Even as Lawrence Taylor reached historical milestones that very few defensive players had ever touched, that ascent still occurred in painful silence. Victory celebration nights brought no peace, but only prolonged the spiral of partying and self-destruction. The praises did not soothe the feeling of emptiness, but sometimes even made him feel trapped in the image others expected. Success became pressure to maintain, and to maintain it, Lawrence Taylor continued to push himself further, play more ferociously, live more extremely, as if only that way was he worthy of the legend being built. In the eyes of NFL history, this period will forever be remembered as the era when Lawrence Taylor dominated the league, permanently changing how people think about defense. But beneath the surface of those MVP, Super Bowl, and DPOY awards, another truth was also forming. His off-field life had never been healed, never restructured to exist long-term. That soaring career, therefore, was not just a story of talent and victory, but also the foundation for the later tragedy, when everything once covered by glory began to emerge. Lawrence Taylor gave the NFL the greatest things a defensive player could offer, but throughout that process, very few stopped to ask what he needed to survive when the lights went out. And that very silence, lasting through his most glorious years, made Lawrence Taylor's success both a blinding peak and the opening words for a pain he would have to face alone when his career was no longer strong enough to shield the real person behind the legend. From the peak of a career soaring in painful silence, Lawrence Taylor's life gradually split into two parallel halves that existed but never truly met. A true double life, where glory and chaos grew together in the same person. On the field, Lawrence Taylor was almost immortal. Every time he stepped out of the tunnel, the entire stadium changed its breathing rhythm. Opposing quarterbacks had to adjust their gaze, coaches had to redraw schemes, and the entire NFL operated differently just because of his presence. He played as if there were no limits, as if physical pain did not exist, as if every game was a battle for survival that he was born to dominate. The sacks, the pursuits from the blind side, the moments destroying opponents' plans happened with precision and intensity that made people believe Lawrence Taylor was made from a different material than the rest of the league. In that world, he was the symbol of absolute control, of pure power, of a man who could not be subdued. But when the stadium lights went out, a different Lawrence Taylor began to appear, a person who could not control himself, swept into the spiral of addiction, partying, and successive self-destructive behaviors. Off the field, there was no clear tactic, no transparent rules, no defined role. The emotional voids that football had never healed now surged strongly, and Taylor sought to fill them with different intensity. Stimulants, chaotic relationships, prolonged sleepless nights. The most terrifying thing was not that these two people existed, but that they never touched each other. The Lawrence Taylor on the field learned nothing from the Lawrence Taylor off it, and vice versa. The chaos off the field was never strong enough to interrupt the legend operating every Sunday. His teammates knew. They saw the clear difference between the defensive leader during game time and the tired, unstable person behind the locker room door. They knew about the prolonged parties, about the use of stimulants, about the signs that Taylor was going too far. But in the NFL culture of the 1980s, knowing did not mean intervening. Teammates needed Lawrence Taylor on the field, needed his strength and presence to win, and therefore, silence became the easiest choice. No one wanted to be the one to break the fragile balance between collective glory and personal truth. Loyalty to the team, to victory, to the familiar rhythm of the season, was placed higher than the responsibility to intervene in a person's life. The media knew too. Sideline stories, rumors, off-field incidents gradually appeared, but they were often told in a tone that was both curious and tolerant. Lawrence Taylor was seen as the NFL's bad boy, an eccentric genius living beyond norms, and that image even increased the appeal of his legend. Instead of being recognized as cries for help, the signs of instability were romanticized, turned into spice for the story of a unique warrior. When he continued to play excellently, everything was forgiven. When he brought victories, every moral boundary seemed loosened. The media reflected what the public wanted to believe, that Lawrence Taylor was extraordinary but still in control, that he knew what he was doing. The problem was that no one actually checked if that was true. There was no systematic intervention, no mandatory stopping point, no one seriously asking about the price paid for maintaining two separate lives. Lawrence Taylor continued to live in a fragmented state, where he only truly lived on the field, While off, it was a series of aimless, drifting days. The more successful, the greater the distance between those two people. The more revered, the more he was trapped in the image others expected, with no escape to return to being a whole person. Lawrence Taylor's double life was not intentional hypocrisy, but the consequence of a system that allowed him to exist that way. The NFL needed an immortal Lawrence Taylor on the field, so it accepted a chaotic Lawrence Taylor off it. The team needed victories, so it turned a blind eye to dangerous signs. The media needed stories, so it turned potential tragedy into vivid legend. In that picture, Lawrence Taylor was both beneficiary and victim. He was given power without the tools to manage it, allowed to destroy others without being taught how to protect himself. The greatest pain of this double life lay in the fact that there was no moment of intersection. There was no time when those two people sat down to face each other, for the Lawrence Taylor on the field to look straight at the Lawrence Taylor off it and admit that victory could not heal everything. Every time the chaos threatened to spill over, another outstanding game appeared to cover it. Every time consequences began to show, another title, another iconic sack pulled the story back to the old track. And so, that double life lasted for many years without being broken. But the fragmentation could not exist forever without leaving cracks. What was not faced would accumulate. What was not healed would find a way to erupt. And those two people who never met would finally collide in a moment when no victory was strong enough to shield it. The central part of Lawrence Taylor's tragedy lies right here. Not in the fact that he lived two lives, but in the fact that the entire world around him knew it, saw the growing misalignment more clearly, but no one had enough courage or enough responsibility to force those two people to meet before it was too late. As the two people in that double life continued to exist in parallel without ever touching each other, the price Lawrence Taylor had to pay began to imprint itself on his very body and mind in a slow but irreversible way. The years of playing football at extreme intensity, where every charge was a full-force collision, left clear marks. Injuries for Lawrence Taylor were not isolated accidents, but a continuous accumulation. Aching knees, a back under heavy pressure, shoulders and neck bearing hundreds of impacts each season. Pain became a constant state, something he woke up with every morning and carried throughout the day. But in the NFL culture of the 1980s, pain was not a signal needing treatment, but a sign that you were still tough enough to continue. At first, drugs and stimulants only played the role of recreation, part of partying, a way to unwind after tense games. But very quickly, the line between recreation and pain relief began to blur. When physical pain no longer disappeared after a few days of rest, when mental pressure could no longer be soothed just by victory, Lawrence Taylor turned to those substances for more practical purposes, to be able to sleep, to forget the aching sensation, to maintain the state he needed to step onto the field like a warrior. There was no medical or psychological system seriously asking what a player was using, why he was using it, as long as he was still capable of performing. And therefore, the use of stimulants gradually shifted from choice to habit, then from habit to dependence. At the same time, Lawrence Taylor's mind began to lose the necessary boundaries. The intensity of life off the field was no longer clearly separate from the intensity on the field. Prolonged sleepless nights, continuous strings of partying, and the use of stimulants made his ability to self-control increasingly weaken. He could no longer clearly distinguish when he was avoiding pain, when he was seeking sensation, and when he simply could not stop. Behaviors once seen as impulsive began to take on a compulsive nature, as if without them, he no longer knew how to exist. The most dangerous thing was that Lawrence Taylor was still good enough to hide that fracture for a long time. On the field, he was still a terror, still able to bounce back after collisions, still able to break opposing offensive lines with instinct and experience. That very fact made everyone around him believe that his body and mind were still operating stably, that what happened off the field was just the extravagant lifestyle of a star. But inside, the accumulated fatigue grew larger. His body no longer recovered as before, and his mind no longer had enough clarity to realize he was going too far. When dependence formed, the boundaries of sobriety gradually disappeared. Lawrence Taylor no longer had moments of complete clarity to look back at himself and ask questions. Everything blended into a continuous flow of intensity, where pain was blurred by stimulants, and stimulants in turn weakened control, leading to increasingly reckless decisions. He was no longer just fighting opponents on the field, but fighting his own deteriorating body and mind slipping off track, but without being equipped with any tools to win that battle. Physical injuries and mental dependence formed a cruel loop. The more pain, the more he needed drugs to continue. The more dependent, the weaker the body and mind became, making the pain and instability more severe. No one truly broke that loop. There was no mandatory pause for healing, no comprehensive intervention to restructure his life. In the system's eyes, Lawrence Taylor was still a usable asset, and therefore, his fracture was seen as an acceptable price for the greatness he brought. Looking back at this period, it is clear that Lawrence Taylor's body and mind did not collapse in a single moment, but were eroded day by day. Chronic pain not only made him dependent on stimulants, but also blurred his ability to self-reflect. He gradually lost his inner anchor, living in a state where sobriety and haze mixed, where decisions were made not by reason, but by immediate need. And right here, the tragedy moved to a new level. Lawrence Taylor was no longer just a person living two parallel lives, but became one with no clear boundary between his true self and what was destroying him. A fractured body, a mind out of control, and in the familiar silence of the system that had indulged him, nothing stopped that spiral from pulling him further, preparing for the falls where even the legend on the field was no longer strong enough to shield. When the body was already fractured, and the mind no longer had sober boundaries, what had once been carefully shielded around Lawrence Taylor finally began to collapse in front of the public, opening a phase of irreversible public crises. If before, his deviations could still be hidden behind locker room doors, behind private parties or silent arrangements, now everything was exposed nakedly. The suspensions began to appear as the first sign that the NFL no longer had the ability or willingness to continue turning a blind eye. The use of banned substances, increasingly clear disciplinary violations, forced the league to act, not because they suddenly cared about the person Lawrence Taylor, but because the silence had become too dangerous for the overall image. But suspensions were only the beginning. When the on-field career was no longer strong enough to shield, off-field problems quickly spiraled out of control. Arrests, serious accusations related to personal behavior, appeared in newspapers with dense frequency, turning Lawrence Taylor from a sports legend into a name tied to scandals. The media, which had once elevated him as a symbol of ferocity and greatness, now turned to dissecting every private detail, every mistake, every moment of collapse. No more romanticizing language, no more tolerance for the genius bad boy. Instead, cold headlines, images cut out of context, and a story retold completely differently. Lawrence Taylor's reputation collapsed in the most painful way, not because he played worse, but because the legend image was torn apart before the American public. People no longer talked about the sacks that changed NFL history, but about handcuffed photos, court sessions, accusations that made him a symbol of downfall. For someone who had been completely defined by strength and power, losing that image was almost like losing himself. Lawrence Taylor not only lost the system's shielding, but also lost the story that had protected him for many years. The bitterness lay in the fact that when all these crises happened, very few people still cared about how they had accumulated. The public saw the final result and judged the person, while the entire prior process of indulgence, neglect, and exploitation almost disappeared from the story. Lawrence Taylor became the representative face for personal collapse, while the system that had profited from him quietly withdrew. No more coaches standing up to protect, no more team shielding, and the NFL at this point had only one choice: cut ties to protect itself. These public crises had a destructive impact on Lawrence Taylor in a way no on-field injury had ever caused. The shame, public pressure, and feeling of exposure made him fall into a constant defensive state. There was no longer space for mistakes in silence. Every step he took was scrutinized. Every decision could become the next day's headline. For someone who had never been taught how to face emotions or take responsibility for himself in a context without glory, this shock was almost too much to bear. The torn legend image also led to a change in how fans viewed him. The cheers of the past gave way to disappointment, anger, or pity. Lawrence Taylor, who had once made the entire league fear him, now became a vivid warning about the dark side of fame and indulgence. Every time his name appeared in the press, it reminded the public that even the greatest icons could collapse when no longer shielded by the system. In this chain of crises, the most painful thing was not just that Lawrence Taylor lost his reputation, but that he was forced to face himself in the most naked state. No longer a field to escape to, no longer victories to compensate, he had to look straight at the consequences of many years living in fragmentation. But instead of being supported to rebuild his life, he entered a phase of public judgment, where every mistake became evidence reinforcing the story of a legend who was over. The public crises therefore marked an irreversible turning point. This was the moment Lawrence Taylor was no longer shielded by talent, by the system, or by the legend. Everything he had relied on to exist vanished at once, leaving a naked person before the gaze of all America. And right in that moment, his tragedy reached its climax. No longer a parallel story between glory and chaos, but a complete collapse of image, reputation, and identity, paving the way for the post-legend years full of loneliness and pain ahead. After the public crises that tore apart that legendary image, the most painful moment in Lawrence Taylor's life did not come from a courtroom or a sentence, but from the cold silence of the NFL itself, the place that had once worshipped him as the ultimate weapon. The indulgence vanished as quickly as it was cruel. The phone calls that were always answered, the doors that were always open, now closed without explanation. No more excuses like he brings victories. No more behind-the-scenes compromises to keep everything under control. When Lawrence Taylor no longer fit the image the league wanted to protect, the NFL chose the easiest thing: turn its back. That feeling of being left behind was not like defeat on the field, where you still have teammates, still have a chance to get up in the next half. This was defeat without a countdown clock, without tactics to adjust, without cheers to hold on to. Lawrence Taylor, who had been built into a symbol of strength and ferocity, now became a name the system wanted to distance itself from. The stories once told with admiration were now replaced by caution, even avoidance. The NFL no longer wanted to mention him as part of the present, because every time it did, it had to face its own dark side. That abandonment was structural rather than personal. The NFL did not publicly condemn Lawrence Taylor with long moral statements. It simply withdrew. No more official roles. No more implicit sponsorship. No more sense of belonging. For someone whose whole life had been defined by belonging to the field, to the locker room, being cut off from that community was like being cut off from oxygen. Lawrence Taylor did not just lose his job or reputation. He lost the only space that had ever brought order to his life. Loneliness became the dominant emotion enveloping these years. No more game schedule to cling to. No more coaches to take orders from. No more teammates to share victories or defeats. The unstructured days exposed the voids that football had once hidden. Lawrence Taylor had to face himself in a state without role, without clear purpose. For a person who had never been taught how to live without intensity and conflict, this silence became an unbearable burden. The bitterness was that the turning away happened almost simultaneously from many sides. The team that had once profited from his ferocity no longer had motivation to protect him. The league that had built its image around him no longer wanted to take responsibility for the long-term consequences. The media, which reflected the system's attitude, also shifted, talking less about legacy and more about mistakes. Lawrence Taylor was pushed into the position of an individual solely responsible for everything, while the role of the previous indulgent environment was blurred. In that loneliness, the feeling of abandonment did not just come from losing protection, but from the realization that the love for him had never been unconditional. It existed only as long as he was useful, as long as he brought victories and drama. When he became an image burden, that love disappeared. For Lawrence Taylor, this was a profound identity shock. If he was no longer the player, no longer the worshipped legend, who was he? That question echoed in the void the NFL left behind, with no easy answer. The NFL's turning away, therefore, was not just an organizational action, but the harshest emotional shift in Lawrence Taylor's tragedy. It marked the moment he was truly separated from the world that had created him, forced to face the consequences without any protective network. This was the point where the story was no longer about football, but about a human being left amid the ruins of the very legend that the system had built with him. And in that prolonged silence, Lawrence Taylor began to enter the most difficult phase, continuing to live without a place to belong, carrying the heavy feeling of abandonment like an injury that never heals. When the NFL had turned its back and the stadium doors closed completely, Lawrence Taylor entered a void that his whole life had never prepared him to face. Life without the stage. No more bright lights shining down every Sunday. No more roaring cheers lifting the spirit. No more season rhythm to anchor time. Lawrence Taylor, for the first time, had to live in prolonged silence. For a person formed, recognized, and loved through intensity, that silence did not bring peace, but exposed all the inner voids. The unstructured days became endlessly long, and each morning waking up without a clear goal made him feel lost in his own life. Without the field to escape to, what had once been hidden now surged strongly. Addiction, which had crept in for many years, was no longer restrained by training schedules or playing responsibilities. Stimulants were no longer just a way to unwind after games, but became tools to endure the emptiness, to fill the feeling of uselessness, gradually eroding self-respect. When the body was no longer released through collisions, Lawrence Taylor's mind turned to self-attack, and self-destructive habits became more constant than ever. Along with addiction came depression, a state he had never had the language to name. Lawrence Taylor did not grow up in an environment that encouraged talking about emotions, and his career further reinforced the belief that weakness must be hidden. After retirement, when there was no longer a role to play, no longer a legend to maintain, depression did not appear as a violent explosion, but as a thick fog, covering every thought and action. He gradually lost interest in things that once brought joy, felt exhausted despite doing nothing, and carried a vague sense of guilt about a life that had slipped off track without knowing how to fix it. The post-retirement void for Lawrence Taylor was not just lacking a job, but the disintegration of identity. For many years, he had been taught that his value lay in his ability to destroy opponents, in the fear he instilled, in the victories he brought. When all that vanished, there was no other foundation to rely on. He had not been prepared to become an ordinary citizen, a person living without extreme intensity. Every time he looked back at the past, the glorious memories did not bring pure pride, but came with loss and bitterness, because they reminded him of something that would never return. The loneliness after retirement was made worse by the fact that the social network around Lawrence Taylor also gradually dissolved. The people who had once surrounded him when he was the center of the stage no longer had reason to appear regularly. Not all turned away maliciously. But the distance was unavoidable when the spotlight was gone. Lawrence Taylor, who had once been the focus of all attention, now had to face long evenings with no one calling, no place needing his presence. That sudden shift made the feeling of abandonment even deeper. In this phase, Lawrence Taylor struggled to find ways to fill the void, but without suitable tools. He did not know how to build new habits, did not know how to seek help sustainably, and did not believe he deserved sympathy. Short-term efforts to change often quickly collapsed when facing inner pressure he had never learned to manage. Without the stage to shield, every failure became more personal, more painful, and harder to escape. After retirement, Lawrence Taylor's life appeared like a vast desert after many years living in storms. No more cheers to drown out the silence, no more victories to justify mistakes, only addiction, depression, and prolonged emptiness. This was not the end of the tragedy, but the phase where the tragedy forced him to face himself directly, with no legend left to stand in replacement. And in that harsh quiet, Lawrence Taylor stood before a choice he had never been prepared for. Either continue sliding in loneliness, or find a way to redefine himself in a world without a stage to hide behind. After the long period sunk in post-retirement emptiness, when addiction and depression had eroded almost everything left, Lawrence Taylor began late efforts to pull himself back, not as a legend, but as a human being trying to keep living. There was no opening whistle for this phase, no coach standing on the sideline shouting, and no scoreboard to measure success. Those efforts happened in silence, slowly and full of doubt, because Lawrence Taylor had never been taught how to heal, only how to win. Quitting addiction was the first step, and also the hardest. For someone accustomed to using intensity to exist, facing sobriety was a real shock. The days without stimulants exposed the physical and mental pain he had avoided for many years. With nothing to blur memories or guilt, Lawrence Taylor was forced to look straight at what he had lost: reputation, relationships, and a large part of identity. The quitting process did not go smoothly. There were relapses, disappointments, and moments he wondered if continuing had meaning when the past still haunted. But unlike during his playing days, where every mistake could be compensated by another outstanding game, this phase allowed no quick escapes. Each sober day was simply one more day lived, nothing more. Parallel to quitting addiction was the effort to seek stability, a concept almost foreign to Lawrence Taylor. He learned to establish small habits, waking up on time, eating regularly, participating in support programs, and accepting that progress does not always have a clear shape. No resounding victories, no explosive moments making everyone tip their hats. Instead, there were fragmented steps, sometimes almost invisible, but requiring patience he had never trained throughout his career. Living slower, listening to body and mind, for Lawrence Taylor, was harder than any confrontation on the field. In this process, Lawrence Taylor gradually realized that the goal was no longer to return to the peak or restore the legendary image. What he sought was simply the ability to exist without self-destruction, the ability to get through a day without needing to escape. This was a fundamental change in how he viewed his own value. If before, value was measured by the fear he instilled and the number of wins he brought, now it was measured by how long he could keep himself away from old habits. That was not victory by any sports definition, but the only victory left that he could pursue. Those late efforts also came with the bitter acceptance that not everything could be fixed. Some relationships that broke could not be mended. Some opportunities that passed would never return, and the public image might never fully recover. Lawrence Taylor had to learn to live with that, learn not to see those losses as reasons to return to the old spiral. This was the hardest lesson, because it required him to give up the hope that just trying hard enough would make everything return to how it was. In the silence of the days without the stage, Lawrence Taylor gradually understood that stability did not bring excitement, but brought something he had never had: the ability to be at peace with himself. The rare, sober moments at first gradually lasted longer, and though the emptiness had not disappeared, it no longer completely swallowed him. Continuing to live, in this sense, was not a journey upward, but an effort not to fall deeper. Lawrence Taylor's late efforts were not recognized with titles or applause. They happened outside the public's view, without creating a new heroic story to compensate for the old tragedy. But precisely in that humility, this phase carried different meaning. For the first time in life, Lawrence Taylor was not fighting to dominate, not fighting to prove, but fighting to survive. And though the final victory might never come, the fact that he continued to walk, one day at a time, had become the bravest act in a life once defined entirely by strength and violence. As the late efforts helped Lawrence Taylor stand firmer day by day, an unavoidable truth gradually emerged clearer than ever. The greatness he achieved had left a tremendous price, spanning every aspect of life. Family was the first place to feel that loss. The years Lawrence Taylor lived in high intensity, in addiction and chaos, had eroded close relationships in a silent but ruthless way. Emotional absence, impulsive outbursts, and wrong choices made the distance between him and loved ones grow larger. There were moments that should have belonged to family traded for career, and when he turned back to seek connection, many cracks were too deep to fully mend. Lawrence Taylor did not lose his family in an absolute sense, but he lost the simplicity and peace that a man of his age should have had. Health was the next price, and perhaps the clearest one. The body that was once the most feared weapon in the NFL now bore the marks of thousands of collisions. Chronic pain was not just physical aftermath, but a constant reminder of a time living beyond limits. Abusing stimulants to endure pain and pressure had left long-term consequences, making the recovery process harder. Lawrence Taylor did not emerge from his career with an intact body, but with one exhausted from being used to depletion, where each ache was tied to memories of glory and self-destruction. The mind, which once helped him read games faster than anyone, also did not escape that price. The years living in high-stress states, combined with addiction and depression, had eroded mental stability. Lawrence Taylor had to learn to live with heavy silences, with regret over past choices, and with the fear that part of the damage was permanent. Finding psychological balance again was not about victory, but a journey of accepting that some things could not return to how they were. For someone accustomed to winning through strength and will, that acceptance was the hardest challenge. Reputation, which once brought Lawrence Taylor to the peak, was also a double-edged sword. He is remembered as one of the greatest defensive players of all time, the one who changed how the NFL played football. But alongside admiration is the image of a chaotic life, public scandals, and collapses that made his legacy complicated. Lawrence Taylor was not allowed to be just a sports legend. He is also a vivid lesson about the dark side of indulgence and fame. That reputation both protected him in the past and continued to follow him like a shadow, reminding that greatness does not erase consequences. Looking back at the entire journey, the unspoken question arises without needing a direct answer. Was the victory worth this price? For Lawrence Taylor, the answer is not simple. Without American football, he might never have escaped the invisibility of childhood. Without the ferocity and special talent, he would not have become an icon, not reached the peak that very few have seen. But that very path also took from him stability, peace, and a large part of personal life. The price paid for Lawrence Taylor's greatness lies not only in what he lost, but in what he has to live with every day. The victories still exist in history. The titles are still mentioned, but behind them is a human being carrying physical, mental, and emotional aftermath. This is not a denial of his greatness, but a more complete view of it. Lawrence Taylor is not just the legend who conquered the NFL, but a human being who paid dearly to become that legend. And in that complex truth His story goes beyond sports, becoming a reminder that greatness, if not accompanied by protection and healing, can leave wounds deeper than any defeat on the field. From the price paid for that greatness, Lawrence Taylor's legacy emerges as an irreducible paradox, both brilliant enough to change history and painful enough to never be complete. In terms of expertise, few arguments can deny his influence. Lawrence Taylor permanently changed how the NFL viewed the linebacker position. Before him, linebackers were mainly seen as the second defensive layer, reacting after the offensive line deployed. After him, linebackers became the attacking spearhead, the initiator of chaos, the living pressure forcing opponents to restructure their entire protection system. Blindside tackle became a mandatory concept. Blocking schemes were redrawn, and the role of defense was no longer waiting for mistakes, but creating mistakes. In this sense, Lawrence Taylor was not just excellent. He was the new standard, the measure that every subsequent generation had to compare against. That is why it is no surprise he is often called the defensive GOAT. That title does not come from nostalgia, but from the reality that what Lawrence Taylor achieved still impacts to this day. Modern edge defenders, versatile pass rushers, defensive players given freedom to break attacking structures all bear traces of the revolution he started. On film, his strength, speed, and instinct still astonish viewers. On the stat sheet, individual and team titles still stand firm as proof of an era of domination. In this aspect, Lawrence Taylor's legacy is undeniable, and NFL history will forever have to write his name in the most important chapter of modern defense. But right here, the contradiction begins to appear, because that legacy does not exist in a vacuum. It is tied to a personal story full of wounds, to years of indulgence, addiction, and public collapse. When mentioning Lawrence Taylor, people do not just mention sacks or Super Bowls, but also the crises that tore apart the legendary image. This makes his legacy complicated in a way few sports icons have to face. He cannot be told as a pure story of victory, nor reduced to a simple moral lesson. His legacy lies between two opposing poles, great enough to be impossible to ignore, and painful enough to be impossible to overlook. That incompleteness also lies in how society chooses to remember him. For one group of fans, Lawrence Taylor is forever the embodiment of the ferocious, original, and unforgiving American football, a time when defense dominated by instinct and strength. For others, he is a warning about the dark side of fame, about the human price paid when the system prioritizes victory over safety and healing. Those two views coexist, sometimes clashing sharply, but neither can completely erase the other. Precisely this parallel makes Lawrence Taylor's legacy both vivid and haunting. On a deeper level, his legacy raises uncomfortable questions for the NFL itself and American sports culture. Can a system be proud of tactical revolutions without facing the accompanying human consequences? Lawrence Taylor is honored for opening a new era for defense, but that era was also built on legitimizing violence and silence in the face of mental wounds. Looking back, it is impossible to separate Lawrence Taylor from the context that nurtured him, a context that both enabled genius to bloom and allowed tragedy to silently accumulate. Therefore, his legacy is not just a personal story, but a mirror reflecting an entire era. The contradiction is also evident in how Lawrence Taylor views himself. He knows he changed the game, knows he belongs in the greatest ranks, but he also lives with irreversible consequences, with the feeling that part of his life was consumed for glory. Legacy, in this case, is not just what others say about him, but what he carries every day. Pride intertwined with regret, recognition accompanied by loss. No statue or title can resolve that contradiction. Therefore, when talking about Lawrence Taylor's legacy, it cannot stop at the defensive GOAT title, nor focus only on the tragedy. That legacy exists in the uncomfortable but honest middle ground. He permanently changed the linebacker position, elevating defense to an active and fearsome status. At the same time, his life shows that greatness can accompany deep wounds if there are no proper protective structures. That legacy is not complete, but precisely that incompleteness makes Lawrence Taylor's story still mentioned, still debated, and still forces people to think. Ultimately, Lawrence Taylor's contradictory legacy is not a stain to hide, but a truth to tell fully. It reminds that sports history is not just written by victories and tactical revolutions, but by specific human beings, with limits, wounds, and consequences. Lawrence Taylor will forever be remembered as the one who changed the NFL, but also as a cautionary tale that greatness, if not accompanied by responsibility and healing, can leave cracks that never fully close. After all the contradictions of that legacy, Lawrence Taylor's story does not close with a complete redemption arc or a glorious recovery like in familiar sports movies, but with a quiet, slow, and heavy ending where only a man who has survived his own life remains. There is no final shining moment to erase the past, no new title to balance the losses, and no miracle to return to him the years that passed in chaos. Lawrence Taylor enters old age carrying the full weight of a life lived at extreme intensity, where every victory leaves a mark, and every mistake carves deeper over time. He does not become a perfectly cleansed moral example. The cracks do not disappear just because time passes. His body still carries lingering aches. His mind still has to learn to live with memories and regrets, and his reputation remains forever tied to both greatness and tragedy. Lawrence Taylor does not emerge from this story as an ultimate winner, but as someone who has endured long enough to still stand. And in that context, survival is not obvious, but a silent achievement rarely praised, but deeply meaningful. The final years do not bring Lawrence Taylor absolute peace. He does not find a completely new version of life detached from the past, because that past is too large to leave behind. But he learns to exist alongside it, learns not to let old mistakes continue controlling every present decision. That is a slow process, often fragile, where each day passing without self-destruction is a small victory. Without lights, without cheers, without a stage to hide behind, Lawrence Taylor has to face himself in the most naked state, and the fact that he continues to live, continues to exist, says more than any public apology. Looking back at the entire journey, what remains is not the stat sheet or debates about his place in NFL history, but the image of a human being who has gone through all the extremes of fame, from the boy growing up in instability, to the legend who forced an entire league to change, then to the one abandoned when the system no longer needed him. Lawrence Taylor has lived fully both the bright and dark sides of talent. He was given power that very few have ever held, but not given the tools to manage it, and that very imbalance shaped his entire fate. There is no perfect redemption in this story, because not all losses can be compensated. Some relationships broke forever, some opportunities passed never to return, and some wounds became part of who he is. Lawrence Taylor does not stand here to deny those things. He stands here as an aging man, carrying everything he lost, but not letting it pull him down further. His survival does not take the shape of victory, but the shape of endurance and acceptance. What makes this ending heavy yet necessary is that it forces people to look straight at a truth sports often avoids. Lawrence Taylor is not a rare exception, but an amplified version of a familiar pattern. Talent worshipped, exploited to the fullest, then left behind when no longer fitting. His story shows that greatness does not automatically come with protection, and victory never replaces learning to live as a whole human being. When history's lights shine back, Lawrence Taylor appears not just as a defensive legend, but as a cautionary tale. He shook an entire league, forcing the NFL to change structures, tactics, and thinking about defense. But that very talent, when not placed in a framework of human care, turned back to attack him in a slow and ruthless way. Not because he was weak, but because he was never taught how to protect himself when victory was gone. And therefore, the final message of this story does not lie in judging Lawrence Taylor, but in understanding him. Understanding that talent, no matter how great, is not enough to shield a person from collapse without guidance, limits, and timely healing. Lawrence Taylor survived, not to become a perfect role model, but to become living proof of an uncomfortable but necessary truth. Talent can shake an entire league, but if no one teaches you how to live, if no one teaches you how to stop, that talent can also destroy you. And in the silence of old age, what remains with Lawrence Taylor is not glory or titles, but the enduring existence of a human being who has gone through every peak and abyss, and is still here to tell his own story. Looking back at the entire story of Lawrence Taylor, the lingering emotion is not judgment, but sorrow mixed with compassion, for a human being swept too far by his own talent. He is the one who permanently changed how the NFL played defense, forcing the entire league to adjust tactics just to survive his ferocity. But also in those chapters about ascent, we clearly see a prolonged void. No one taught Lawrence Taylor how to control emotions, how to protect himself off the field, or how to live when the lights were gone. The details about addiction stretching from peak years, chronic injuries, the indulgence of the 1980s NFL, and the moment the league turned its back, show that this tragedy did not come unexpectedly but accumulated over years of neglect. What makes the story especially heartbreaking is that Lawrence Taylor did not collapse due to lack of talent or lack of will, but because he was never prepared for a complete life. After retirement, without the stage, without cheers, he faced depression, addiction, and the identity void that football had once hidden. The later efforts at quitting addiction and finding stability did not take the shape of victory, just simply trying to keep living, one day at a time. That very fact makes him worthy of respect, not as a perfect role model, but as a human being who survived the extremes of fame. For the American people, this story is a profound lesson beyond sports. It reminds us that a society that only worships victory while forgetting the human being will soon create similar tragedies. Talent, no matter how great, cannot replace guidance, mental health care, and collective responsibility. Lawrence Taylor is a cautionary tale that success must come with humanity, and that protecting people is as important as honoring achievements. If you feel the pain, the greatness, and the profound lessons from Lawrence Taylor's story, please hit subscribe to join us on the next journeys about legends behind the spotlight. Thank you for listening to The Very Last Moment, and see you in the next video where we continue telling the real stories that sports is never just about victory.